And with that housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Mary Gardiner, and we're very happy to have her with us. She is a researcher, professor, and extension specialist at Ohio State's Department of Entomology. So very busy. Her lab looks at the ecology of urban green spaces, different factors that impact insect populations, and improving biological controls in urban agro-ecosystems. And we were saying much of her research happens in Cleveland, which of course has a lot of urban spaces, and just very interesting work. We'll have one of her colleagues speaking later this month on remediation of soil using organic methods. So good stuff. And she is also the author of Good Garden Bugs, Everything You Need to Know About Beneficial Predatory Insects, which is a nice, very nicely illustrated guide that I would encourage you to check out if this is an area of interest for you. And with that, I will turn it on over to Mary. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to join you remotely today to talk about beneficial insects, particularly this time of year when we're all excited to get outside. So it looks like we have a mix of gardeners, educators, and commercial growers today. So that's awesome. I am going to be talking about, so I study insects at the garden scale. I work in backyards, in vacant lots, in other types of urban ecosystems. So I'm going to be talking about beneficial insects we find in those environments and how to manage for them. Many of these practices can be scaled up to small or even large scale farms. And so if you have questions, about how someone does that, that can be something that we talk about in the discussion afterwards, as many of my examples and background, as I say, focus on residential landscapes. So I'll go ahead and share my presentation. All right. And so today I'm going to be talking about beyond bees, supporting other good garden bugs. So I study bees as well. And like 99% of the time someone asks me to give a presentation, it's about bees. And so I'm always thrilled when someone wants to know about something else, because my entire background is on studying predatory insects and natural pest control. And so it's a topic that I find very interesting. So I wanted to give just a very brief background about myself. I am a professor of entomology at OSU. I'm located in Columbus. 85% of my job responsibilities are doing research. And as I said, we focus on urban green space ecology, specifically vacant land, and also managing your home landscape for beneficial insects. I also have done quite a bit of work with declining ladybug populations and their conservation. Because I have a large research appointment, I get to work with a lot of great young people in my research. These are postdocs and graduate students who do all of the work that we publish and inform all of our conservation efforts in the lab. I am an extension specialist in the state. Most of my programming focuses on activities for home gardeners and master gardeners, but we've also gotten more and more into 4-H programming. If you have young people in your life who are interested in insects, there is a new entomology 4-H curriculum available that I wanted to promote. And we also do a lot of citizen science programs. And so if you really like this presentation and want to engage with us in our research, I'm happy to provide more information on how you can do that. I also get to teach, which is something I really enjoy. I teach 3 classes at the grad level. I teach grant writing, so how do you get the money, presentation skills, how do you present about the stuff you got the money for, and I also teach insect ecology, so that's my contribution sort of to our basic knowledge for our grad students. And here we are pre-COVID working on some grant projects, but we've continued to teach remotely this semester. I'm doing the presentation class. So hopefully this presentation won't be terrible because I'm supposed to be good at giving presentations. So what do we know about good bugs? So what insects provide us in agro-ecosystems and in home landscapes? So insects provide many ecosystem services. They're pollinators, such as these bees and flies shown here. They provide pest control, which is what we're going to talk about today. So that's parasitoids as well as predatory insects. One thing sometimes people forget when they're designing landscapes and agricultural environments is the importance of food web structures, so insects for wildlife. And also, they're just really amazing creatures that contribute to our biodiversity and are really a diverse part of our biodiversity here in Ohio. So in today's talk, we're going to focus on natural enemies. And natural enemies are insects that provide pest control and how to use habitat management to enhance their abundance and diversity. So first I want to start off, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about predators, and then we're going to talk about parasitoids at the end. So predators are animals that actively hunt and search for their prey. Many of the insects I'm going to talk about are generalists. Many times, especially a lot of farmers, and I totally understand this because you face such big pest problems, want one answer. So I have this pest, what is the natural enemy that I need? Unfortunately, what you're really working towards is creating a habitat where many different insects can live, because for most of these insects, they're generalists. They're going to eat whatever is abundant. So if a pest is abundant, they're going to target it, but you're going to need many players in that system to have season-long pest control. So that's what I mean by generalists. These predators will eat many different types of food, but they also use a lot of different hunting strategies. So some insects like this praying mantis they use vision to find their prey, but some insects use tectorial cues like these eyeless maggots that are eating aphids on this leaf. You know, they don't have eyes, but they're still able to find insects. And so there's all sorts of different strategies that predators use to find their insects. And we'll talk about that with the different groups of insects. So what I'm going to do is take a taxonomic approach kind of through the fauna of common predators that you would find that are helpful in pest control. And we'll start with the biggest, and that's the mantids. And so mantids are one of those insects that I think even people that hate insects like mantids. They do not necessarily eat a lot of the very common insect pests like aphids and scales and very tiny things, but they will eat larger insect pests like flies and other larger moths, active hunting adults that may have a pest immature stage. They're not active hunters, they're sit and wait. So we've all seen a mantid hunt. They use their eyes to catch their prey. Interestingly, not many people realize that the two most common mantids that we have in Ohio are actually alien species from other countries. So the European mantid has this eye spot on the inner side of its front raptorial leg, and you'll find this one very commonly. That was introduced in the US to provide pest control in the 1800s from Europe. We also have a slightly larger Chinese mantid. This Chinese mantid has this bright green stripe on its wing. Both of them share, they're common in all sorts of different habitats. They'll eat all sorts of prey. We do have one native species that is less common called the Carolina mantid that occurs in Ohio. And it can be distinguished by having this black spot on its wing. And also the females, the wing does not exceed the abdomen. So you can see some of the abdomen from above. But all three of these are going to be commonly found in agricultural and home environments in this state. Now, this next group are true workhorses that are really undersung as natural predators of pest insects, and these are the true bugs. True bugs as a group all share this piercing beak, and so these insects, there are pests in this group, so stink bugs are in this group, and you know that they have this piercing beak that goes into fruits and vegetables, but there are predatory true bugs that have more of a curved beak that they use to stab insect pests and ingest the liquid contents. So something that's eaten by a true bug, you will find like a shriveled carcass remaining after the true bug has eaten it. And I love this picture. This is one that's being held for a photograph, and it's desperate to stab that thumb with its piercing beak. Very angry. So these are some of the most common true bugs that are important predators in agri-ecosystems and home garden landscapes. The minute pirate bug is a tiny insect. It's less than a 1/16 of an inch. It has this checkerboard wing pattern. Its immature stage looks sort of like a mite. This is an aphid predator. It eats a lot of aphids. It will also take very small caterpillars and insect eggs. It relies on pollen and nectar quite a bit at certain times of the year. And so we'll talk about different ways to provide that at the end. So this one is very common. Another common true bug is the damsel bug. You can see the piercing beak here. This one is a little larger, about 1/4 of an inch, brown mottled wings, also a really excellent aphid natural enemy. This is the two-spotted stink bug. I wanted to point out that there are some predatory stink bugs out there that are beneficial. This particular stink bug focuses on Colorado potato beetle eggs and larvae. It's not a specialist. It will eat other things, but it really is mostly going to be found on potato plants consuming those prey. And because of stink bugs being such important pests, many people, when they find this, think that they have an additional potato pest. So I wanted to highlight it. There is also a brown stink bug that is a predator called the spine soldier bug that's more of a generalist that will eat a lot of different insects. Keeping with the true bugs, there are some larger true bugs that are going to take bigger caterpillars, bigger prey. And these are in assassin bug family. These are some of the really fun ones to find because they're very cool. So here's one head on. They're quite scary. They have large raptorial front legs. Some of them are sit and wait predators. Some of them will do some moving around looking for prey. This is one that I took a picture of. This is a wheel bug that we found in an urban farm in Cleveland. You can see it's kind of giving me a side eye. It has this large piercing beak. These are about a half an inch long. These are, or even an inch long or more, depending on if they're immature or adult. These are big. They will take any kind of insect that they can catch. They are more active at night. So if you find one during the day, they kind of seem lethargic. And they're called the wheel bug because they have this row of spines on the back. This other one here is called a Mast Hunter. This is actually an alien species from another country that was accidentally introduced in the US, but it is a predatory insect that provides pest control. The one thing that's kind of interesting about this one, so this is the adult stage down here eating a earwig. So you can see this is a pretty big assassin bug. This is its immature stage up here, which is about the size of a pumpkin seed, maybe a little bit smaller than that. And it's called the Mast Hunter because this immature stage hides itself in camouflage by coating itself in soil particles. So it looks like the soil. So it's very fun to find these because they're just very bizarre. But they are important predators of a lot of different insects. These are also active at night. So when you find them during the day, they tend to be down in mulch, kind of hiding out. People also discount the importance of biological control and water features. So if you are putting in a pond or other water feature in your garden, it can become overrun with pests. And this can be an issue for aquatic plants if people are trying to keep aquatic plants alive and flourishing. And so if you avoid using chemicals like algicides and other chemicals to control some of the pests in your ponds, you can actually have them colonized by some very cool true bugs. And I wanted to point out, a lot of these people think are beetles, but they're actually part of the true bug family. So these have that piercing beak, and they're going to eat pests within your water feature. So things like back swimmers and water boatmen and water striders will commonly go into even small water features in an urban environment. Some of these larger ones, if you had a larger pond, you might find them. Never pick these up. They will bite you, especially these larger ones. And it is quite painful. I stepped on one of these once and it was not a happy time. And these all are very cool because just like on land, these aquatic bugs occupy different parts of the pond. So some of them live in the bottom, some of them live on the side or on the emergent vegetation. So if you can make an environment that is hospitable to a number of different species, they're going to deal with pest problems in all of the different aspects of an aquatic environment, just like a terrestrial environment. And I'll go into a terrestrial environment in much more detail, but I threw this in because I think it's something that we don't really think about, especially with ornamental water features in our home landscape, that those can be habitat as well. Okay, so moving from the true bugs, we will go next to one of the cooler, smaller orders of insects. This is the lacewings and other net-veined predators. And I'm going to focus on the green lacewing, which is another true workhorse in agricultural environments. This is a major aphid predator. It's very common. It's even something people will purchase and release. Lacewings, as the adult, get their name by having these big, beautiful wings and long, skinny body with big eyes. They look a little bit like an antlion. They're in the same family as an antlion. This is the larva. You can see here that it has piercing jaws. It's consuming aphids. There are many different species of lacewings. Some of them are called naked lacewings, and this is an example of a naked lacewing larva. Some of them are called debris carrying. This is an example of debris carrying. This is a very bizarre behavior as well. What this does, this larva looks exactly like the naked larva, but in certain species, they will take the carcasses of their prey along with plant material and debris and make a sort of a debris package on their back to hide themselves from birds and other predators. So you can see on the top of this guy, there are insect carcasses and some fuzz that would be sort of off leaves of plants. And so under this big pile is one of these lacewing larvae. As I said, the Neuroptera also includes very cool insects like antlions. These aren't necessarily predators of agricultural importance, but just to show, you can see some family resemblance now with those other larvae as these larvae here. Now, the beetles are another huge group. I think beetles are supposedly the biggest order of insects, but the Hymenoptera people, the wasp people, think that that's not necessarily true. But nonetheless, there are many beetles. And if you are a graduate student in entomology, you really can't get your PhD in most cases if you work in agriculture or any kind of ecology without at some point studying ground beetles. Everybody studies ground beetles because they're extremely species diverse and also ecologically important. Not only are they important in biological control, some of them eat weed seeds, which is very interesting and cool. And they're known as ecological indicators. So you can assess habitat quality by looking at ground beetle communities because people know a whole lot about their ecology. So I wanted to show several different species here. They're called ground beetles because most often they're going to eat pests that you have along the soil surface. So a lot of those insect pests that have a caterpillar stage that lives or larval stage that lives below the soil surface or on the soil surface, something like a cutworm or grub, even a mollusk pest, a slug pest, all of those pests have ground beetle species that will attack them. Most ground beetles are either black with these striated wing covers and shiny or even metallic, and most are on the ground. Now, some will climb trees and eat Lepidoptera or butterfly moth pest egg masses off trees. Here's one on bark. This is, I think, called moth searcher or something. I can't remember the common name, but some of these will climb up. This is a larva of one. It kind of looks like the adult in that it's metallic and shiny, but it has these long plates and it's going into a snail and eating the snail. So there are quite a few of these that specialize on mollusks of various types, which can be really devastating pests. My favorite group are the ladybugs or lady beetles. This is another huge agricultural predator of importance. Lady beetles either focus on eating scale pests, aphid pests, or powdery mildew. There is actually a lady beetle that feeds on powdery mildew. And one woman brought me hundreds of these and thought her garden was infested with them. And I said, actually, you just have a really bad disease issue because these are eating the diseased plants in your garden. So many people think about ladybugs being one insect that's red with black spots, but there are many different species. This is probably our most common species, the multicolored Asian lady beetle. And by the name, you can probably guess that is an introduced species. But we do have some native species like this polished lady beetle and pink lady beetle. This pink lady beetle is exceedingly important in corn pest management in sweet corn. It eats corn pollen and also feeds on corn pest egg masses on the leaves of the plant as well as corn aphids. This black one is called the twice-stabbed lady beetle. It's a scale eater. It's very important in scale pests in tree fruit production, as well as home landscaping trees. If you have scale issues and find these, you have some insects eating those scale pests. Ladybug larvae look a little bit like lacewing larvae. They're long and skinny. A lot of people call them aphid alligators because they're sort of shaped like a little alligator. And they often share some similar color patterns to the adults. You can see here, this one is orange and black, like many adults. Just like the true bugs, there are also predatory beetles that occur in water. And I wanted to point out the Predacious diving beetle. This is its very neat larva that you also probably don't want to handle, but very cool. And this one will dive deep and predate on things all throughout a pond. Also the Whirligig Beetle. This one is very neat. It mostly eats prey on the surface, but it can dive, and it has eyes that go below the ground and above. So it can see both in the water and out of the water at the same time and predate above water and below. And they're called whirligig because they'll get into groups and they will spin around during mating time. They will be looking for males and females in these groups. And they also do just seem to cluster together throughout the season. So they're very interesting to have as well. This is another group that people don't necessarily know the value of, and that would be the flies. And I'm going to focus on the syrphid or hover flies because they're a really amazing group. These are bee and wasp mimics. You can see some of them look kind of like bees and they're fuzzy, like this one almost looks like a honeybee. Some of them look like wasps, like this shiny one here in the bottom. But what differentiates the bees from flies is, well, first of all, the flies are not going to sting. But secondly, the flies have only 2 wings. And so if you're looking at something and trying to figure out, is it a bee or a fly? I always look at the wings and I look at the eyes. Flies have huge eyes. And you can see in both of these cases, they have massive eyes. And bees have big eyes too, but not to the extent where they actually come together on the face like this. These are a very cool group because the adult flies are pollinators and you will find them visiting plants. But the females will look for pest populations on crop plants and lay their eggs in those pest populations, and the larvae will eat them. So these are both a predatory insect and a pollinator in one. So pretty amazing. This is what the larva look like. This is another one where people will think they have 2 pests, maybe an aphid pest and a slug pest, but these are actually eating the aphids. These are eyeless maggots that crawl around, and when they tap into using olfactory and vibrational cues an aphid, they will stab it with their mouth parts and eat it. And you can see stuck to this one on the bottom corner of the slide are these brown things, and those are dead aphids. So it's got its food sort of stuck to itself as it's moved through space on this leaf. There are many other predatory flies out there. There are some very large ones like robber flies that will grab things right out of the air. These will eat day active moths and butterfly pests. They will eat other fly pests. They'll take down wasps. They'll take down other beneficial insects. They're very generalist. So these are both robber flies. This is a long-legged robber fly in the corner, and then a bee mimic robber fly. Another one that's very similar in larval behavior to the hover flies is this predatory midge. It's called an aphid predatory midge. The adult is kind of nondescript and you're very unlikely to identify it in the field, but what you will see are these hot pink to orange larvae. These look very similar to the hoverfly larvae, also shown here in an aphid colony on a leaf. They also eat aphid pests. And they're also brightly colored, but they're a little bit smaller than hoverflies. These are maybe 1/8 of an inch, whereas hoverflies can be up to 1/4 of an inch by the time they're about to pupate. So you really have to look closely to see some of these things. Many of them are nearly the same size as the pests that they will attack. So in addition to flies, we have many wasps that act as important predators. Many of these are solitary species, and many of them attack caterpillar pests. So cultivating wasps in the landscape is very important because, as you know, caterpillar pests are really damaging. So this is a mud dauber wasp and a spider wasp. Both of these eat spiders, so they're not necessarily important for pest control, but I pointed them out because people find them all the time and tell me, I saw this thing dragging a spider. Like, what is it doing? So what it's doing is actually they sting the spider and paralyze it. and then they drag the live spider down into their burrow. So in the foreground of the picture on the bottom is a burrow, and then they'll lay eggs on it and the larvae will eat the spider. So it's very disgusting, but also very interesting. But many of these do actually eat pests that we care about. So here is a cutworm wasp, and it's going to do the same thing. It stings the cutworm to paralyze it, drags it to a burrow, stuffs it in the burrow, and its larvae eat the cutworm. Similar thing here. This one has an inchworm. It's stuffing the inchworm into its nest. Now, potter wasps, instead of digging a burrow, will make these very cool little pots, and they fill them with pests, and then they lay an egg in there and make a mud seal. It's just amazing what some of these things do. This is my all-time favorite in the top. This is a flower wasp. And some of you might have seen these flying right over turf grass before. They're big and furry, and they're more than an inch long. So they're very noticeable and kind of scary. And you wonder, why is it right over my turf? Well, they feed on grubs. So the females can actually detect that there are white grubs under the soil. Once she has mated, she will look for grubs. When she detects one, she will dig. And that's why they're so robust. She digs into the ground, finds it, and lays eggs on it to kill the grub. So these are very beneficial. You never want to spray these in a home landscape. People ask, well, should I be cultivating social wasps for pest control? And the answer is it really depends on your comfort level with wasps. Social wasps are going to pull a ton of caterpillars out of the area that they're occupying. And so if I was growing something for production purposes and found a wasp nest and it wasn't in an area where it was going to harm staff or anyone, I would definitely leave it there. In a home environment, you need to make a call. Is this a risk to children, pets, or is this something that we can maintain? Is it in a good location? Many of these different wasps that live together, such as paper wasps or hornets, obviously can be a risk, but they also provide tremendous pest control of caterpillars. And of course, someone is going to ask me, what's the deal with the Asian hornet? And so I had to point out, if I go back to this slide, we've had the European hornet here in the US for quite some time. It is a very large and aggressive species, more so than some of our native hornets, such as the bald-faced hornet. So some of these decisions may also come down to, well, what am I dealing with? And you may want to ask an expert or send me a picture or send my department a picture. We get a ton of pictures, as you can imagine, of hornets. But we have not found the Asian hornet in Ohio, despite many, many, many photographs being sent. They're almost always the European hornet. So you can see here, there is some color differences, and there are some great websites. If you do find a large hornet and want to try to identify it, there are some great resources like this where there are pictures of side-by-sides online where you can see them. But we don't so far have any record of the Asian hornet outside of the Pacific Northwest. And finally, spiders. So many people discount spiders because they just see the web and think that thing's not doing anything. It's not providing pest control for me. But actually, spiders are incredibly important in agroecosystems. There are many, many tiny spiders that make webs on the soil surface. They eat mite pests. They eat aphid pests. They are very important. But there are also some very large charismatic ones that tend to draw more attention, like these orb weavers. Wolf spiders are incredibly active hunters in agroecosystems and in gardens. Never kill a wolf spider. It's definitely providing you with a lot of pest control. You can identify wolf spiders because the females will carry their egg masses with them. And so if you see one with egg mass like this, you know it's a wolf spider. When the eggs hatch, interestingly enough, they actually climb aboard the mother spider and crawl around. And I sometimes use this to try to get people on my side that spiders aren't creepy, but Cassie is like cringing at that, so it might not work. There are a couple other big spiders that people find that also are in our landscape. This is the fishing spider. It's called the fishing spider because it will hang its leg in a water feature. And when something grabs it, it will pull it out and attack it. Mostly they eat aquatic insects, but some of them are big enough that they will eat fish. So they are very big in certain parts of the world. And these also exhibit maternal care. They carry their egg mass with them in their mouth parts, and then they'll set it down while they hunt, and then they pick it back up and they take it with them. So I think that's very cool. But both of these are big, and I get a lot of pictures of these. The wolf spider being important for pest control, the fishing spider, not really so much, except for in aquatic environments, but just a really neat animal in and of itself. Other ones that you're commonly going to find in gardens and farms, jumping and crab spiders. These are smaller. They're going to exhibit different types of hunting strategies. So the jumping spiders actually jump and grab prey. The crab spiders are called a crab because they have sort of crab-like legs, and they're sit and wait. So they'll sit there, and when a moth pest lands on a plant near them, they will grab it with their big legs. They can also exhibit some color camouflage. So here is a crab spider in the middle inside a flower. And so you really can barely even see it. Now, finally, I want to talk about some other strategies that natural enemies use to control insect pests in ag and gardens. This is parasitism. So in addition to actively hunting and capturing prey, some insect adults will find and locate prey for their offspring. Parasitoid females will lay their eggs either on or inside of an insect pest, and their offspring will consume the insect pest. An example of that are tachinid flies. This is the feather-legged fly. It's an amazing predator of two really damaging pests, the striped cucumber beetle and spotted cucumber beetle in cucurbit systems. So this, the squash bug and cucumber beetle. There are tachinids that attack the squash bug and both cucumber beetles. The feather-legged fly, this orange fly, attacks the squash bug. And this little cutout is from my book showing its life cycle. So the adult female will find a squash bug, and it will land on it and lay eggs on the squash bug. One of those eggs will successfully burrow into the squash bug and eat the squash bug from the inside out, killing it. Then it will come out of the squash bug and make a cocoon in the soil, and it will then emerge and find more squash bugs. There are similar tachinids that attack striped and spotted cucumber beetles, as well as several lepidopteran pests. This funny orange spiny one in the bottom eats caterpillar pests in gardens. There are also wasp parasitoids. Some, like this big picture on the left, they attack wasp pests inside trees. So things like sawflies. This is actually laying an egg inside the tree, inside of an insect pest. There are many important wasps that attack aphids as well. Here in this life cycle, you see a wasp stinging an aphid. It's laying an egg inside the aphid. And then just like in the squash bug example, that larva is going to eat the aphid, killing it. They actually use the aphid's dead carcass as a cocoon to pupate to an adult stage. So this picture here is of a dead aphid, and sometimes you will see brown or black aphids within a patch of aphids, and that definitely means that there's natural enemies at work at that point, that probably many of those other aphids have also been parasitized. And so if you leave that patch there and do not spray it, it will be likely that within a few days you'll see a lot more dead aphids. There are many caterpillar pests as well that are attacked by wasps. Sometimes if the pest is very big, several individuals will develop inside one pest. So here we have one caterpillar, and all of those white things on the top of it are cocoons of parasitoids that have successfully emerged. And so that pest is kind of moribund. It's still a little bit alive, but it's not going to eat the plant. It's just kind of sitting there. It will eventually die, and those wasps will emerge from their cocoons. So there's all sorts of grotesque behaviors happening out there that are providing us with pest control from both parasitoids and predators. And although you can do all sorts of things like release these insects, purchase them and release them, how you're really going to gain sustained pest management, whether you're trying to do this at a big farm scale or in your individual yard, is to manipulate the environment to support all of the life cycle characteristics that I talked about in that PowerPoint. And so what do these insects need to be successful? They need food all season long. They need somewhere to nest. They need water, and they need to be protected from hazards like pesticides that will do them in. And so if we can provide these environmental factors, you can sustain a diverse and abundant predator community during the growing season. So one of the first things to do is to provide them with food. And of course they need prey, but prey are not going to be there all season. I mean, we sort of hope that, right? Like we don't want aphid outbreaks all year. And so at times when there are low prey, they need other food resources. And so if you think about our diet, we need sugar, we need protein, we need fat. So do these insects. And plants provide great sources of protein, fat, and sugar in pollen and nectar. And so if we can provide pollen and nectar at times when pest populations are low, that provides a more sustainable environment for these insects. So the first thing people want to know is, well, what do you plant? So you want plants that are going to be around season long. You want blooms to be there from very early in the spring till very late in the fall. You also want a lot of different colors and shapes because different colors and shapes are going to support different kinds of insects. I'm going to talk about experimenting with native plants, which is something many of you might already be doing if you decided to attend this webinar, but there's a lot of different options out there. There's a lot of less expensive non-native options that are also very, very beneficial for these insects. The one thing to note is that some plants, like some certain petunias, some commercial plants that are bedding plants, are hybrids and produce very little pollen and nectar. So the one thing to note is that, you know, if it smells really sweet, it's probably got a lot of nectar. If you can look in the flowers and visibly see pollen on anthers, that's going to be a good choice rather than plants where those sorts of flower parts are hidden by petals or it really doesn't seem to be making a lot of pollen and nectar. So I'm going to start kind of big and then drill down. So if you're already in the game of creating habitat for beneficial insects, if you have not created a prairie planting or wild field planting, you'll be shocked by the amount of biodiversity you can attract to even a small planting. I have done this at a single yard size, and it's teeming with bees and beneficial insects. Many of these plants are rare and also hosts for many of our butterfly faunas and other insects. And so you're really creating an important ecosystem in addition to providing habitat for natural enemies. Now, this can be done at a homeowner scale. It could be done in acres of land at a very small scale to get started. If you're going to a garden center, many now carry native plants, so you don't have to go anymore to a special garden center. Most of them will have something. The other thing is that I think people are intimidated. So I am very bad actually at growing plants despite my education and continued effort to do so. And these are very hard to kill. So I would highly suggest trying them if you are not the most avid gardener. But one thing you have to pay attention to is if you want to achieve an aesthetic appearance as well, pay attention to the labels. These are prairie plants. And so this is my garage, this is my backyard, and I kind of just throw things in. So this is huge and it's sort of blocking getting into the garage. So, you know, if it says this plant is 20 feet wide by such and such feet tall, like it probably is. So pay attention to that. Also, don't forget about flowering trees and shrubs if you're doing this at a residential level, because those are going to be the first things to bloom in the spring, and that can provide, in many cases, and that can provide important habitat. And if you want lists of plants, go to the Xerces Society to start. They're going to give you a lot of good options. I'm actually developing some garden by number cards that we're going to be releasing in the next year or so that show how to make different, very aesthetically pleasing, beneficial native plant gardens. So that'll be something that maybe I can come back and discuss at a future webinar. There are so many options of recommended plants. When you go to the Xerces Society website, you'll get ready to be overwhelmed. But as I said, you know, this is where you can take your own ideas of what's going to work for your soil conditions, for your needs, for your budget, and make a planting that's going to work for you. You can think about things like color, shape, height. The most important thing is to experiment. And again, look for plants with very open flowers if you're gardening for beneficial insects, because some of these insects are not going to have the special mouth parts like a butterfly where they can go down into a deep flower. And so some flowers that are very open, that's going to provide resources to everyone, regardless of their mouth parts. There can be huge variation within a species. So if a website says you should plant begonias or something, there could be, or dahlias in this case, there could be extreme variation. And remember what I said, if something has open flowers, like in this little picture in the foreground, it's going to have more resources than something like this rose in the background in the top picture, where you can't see the flower parts because insects are not going to be able to access the resources in that flower. So in this big picture, we have two kinds of dahlias. One is a double and one is a single. So single versions of flowers in general are going to be more valuable than doubles. And examples are things like roses, dahlias, and hollyhocks. Those have great sources of pollen and nectar if they're not doubles, but if they are, then they're almost useless for beneficial insects. So looking at both native species and also some of our more antique varieties or historical varieties can be very beneficial. Another thing you can do is plant plants that have extrafloral nectaries. Extrafloral nectaries are things that occur outside of the flowers. So some plants make nectar at their leaf petioles, on the undersides of their leaves, on their buds, all sorts of places. And so here in this little cutout, this is a catalpa leaf, and on the underside of the catalpa leaf, there are these little spots where they just make nectar so that beneficial insects can come along and eat the nectar and then eat any pests on the catalpa plant. And if you've ever walked by a catalpa, it very rarely has holes in the leaves. The same goes for peonies. When you see peonies, they're always covered in ants. Well, the reason that is the ants are eating the extrafloral nectar. So there are a lot of plants, especially lots of trees and shrubs, but also things like vetch that make extrafloral nectar. So vetch is incorporated a lot in borders in ag systems because it's cheap, you can seed it, and it makes extrafloral nectar. So that's a very common one. But in landscaping, there's a lot of different trees and shrubs that you can use that make extrafloral nectar. I just had to show this. Some plants have even evolved to make little cups for the nectar, which is beyond cute. So the insects can come and drink like out of the nectar cup. I should just end at that. I mean, what else do we want in the world but that? Okay, so some information for our farmers. So maybe you don't want to mess around with a lot of perennials. You want to be able to move the planting around year to year. There are some very attractive annual plants that are used a lot in agriculture. And this is what I call the sweet seven, or the most common recommended annual plants that could be seeded in and moved around a lot. So alyssum is a great bedding plant that you could put between rows, especially if you have a small farm, but even in big farms out in California, they will seed strips of it throughout lettuce fields and other cropping systems. Buckwheat is a great cover crop. It can provide early season pollen and nectar if you do allow it to bloom in places along the edge. When you till the cover crop in, if you leave some that is allowed to bloom, that can be a really important resource. Borage is another great edge crop to put in an area that you're not going to cultivate. Some of the herbs that people might grow in a polyculture farm, like coriander and dill, when you're sick of harvesting those for sale or for use, instead of pulling them out, let them bolt, because the pollen and nectar that they make is incredibly attractive. Fava bean and phacelia, sort of like borage and buckwheat, those are also good edge crops. Fava bean makes a lot of extrafloral nectar. It also makes nectar in its flowers, and these are relatively inexpensive to purchase and seed in. The only one of these that I plug usually is alyssum. I've tried to seed it without a lot of success, so we usually plug plant alyssum. The other ones I've had good luck with seeding or plugging. And so, as I said, this could be incorporated within rows of agricultural crops, like here where we have alyssum, or as an insectary buffer on the edge of plantings. And prairie plantings are also incorporated as buffers on the edge, but usually in bigger spaces. So it kind of depends on what you have going on and where you want to put these, and how much flexibility you want in terms of where you can till year to year and how you can move things around in your landscape as to whether annuals or perennials will work best for you. For very small farms and backyards, don't forget the importance of containers. I love this in urban ag too, because we can move the containers around throughout the summer to different beds where we want to attract bees or beneficial insects. In terms of choosing container plants, garden centers are getting really good about saying, hey, these annuals are great butterfly plants. If it says good butterfly plants and it has open flowers, so things like zinnias or alyssum or lantana, those are great insect plants in general. You can choose so many different varieties and incorporate them with habitat plants. I've even found natural enemies hiding in coleus leaves to get out of the sun. So I always put some like big leaved plants in with my flowers to try to create more of a habitat for them. But I highlighted some good options in yellow there of plants that work well in containers. And some people are a lot more creative. I mean, you can go nuts with this, right? Like there's so many beautiful options. This is mallow. This is, these are cosmos in the top, great bee and natural enemy plants. Salvia is a great one for August, September, October. This thing will bloom until it freezes to death. So I always try to use some of that. And here we have zinnias with some petunias in this picture on the right. And this is another one that's so important and some people just do not want to admit that we really have to be more friendly with the way we keep our lawns. So you can do all the things that you want to do, but if you're putting herbicide on your lawn, you're probably killing 80% of the population of natural enemies that you're doing all these other things to support. So particularly in very early spring, I just heard of an initiative yesterday called No Mow May. So in May and April, almost all of our honeybees and other pollinators are going to use lawns for food. And if those lawns are treated, then you're knocking out a big part of the bee population. Ladybugs, when they come out of overwintering, go to dandelions before they go to sweet corn, before they go to agricultural crops. And so again, you know, we all have to do our part to help make sure that they have those resources. I know that that isn't necessarily the most ideal looking lawn for a lot of people. There are coming on the market many very cool flowering lawn options that can be incorporated with no mow or reduced mow turf grasses. And so I think this is a great middle ground to sort of engage in ecological landscaping in a way that's also aesthetically pleasing. So I'm really excited about that. I'm actually going to be testing out several of these at our Waterman farm and hope to invite you to see those in a year or so when we get the plots established. Other things to think about: shelter and overwintering. So in an agricultural crop, if you want to have a lot of spiders and ground beetles, you don't want to have a lot of bare soil. You want to have mulch layers in between your rows, because when the sun is out, those insects will desiccate and they're not going to do well moving between rows of crops. But if you want pollinators, pollinators do not like mulch. They like open soil to nest if they're ground nesting bees. So it's important to cultivate a diversity of different ground covers in your landscape. Overwintering is also important. My neighbor drives me nuts with this because he removes like every stick and piece of mulch from his landscape, and it's just like dead earth throughout most of the year. We have to get better at leaving leaves and leaving sticks and leaving piles of wood in our landscape so things have somewhere to go. So when we harvest our crops, there's nothing left in the field. So if the edge of the field is also mown straight down and there's no piles of wood or no piles of leaves for the natural enemies to go, you're going to start from zero the next year. And so maintaining things like rocks and wood piles and sticks and compost piles, they don't have to be pretty. The insects certainly don't care. Those are really important elements of the landscape. You can also add shelters if you want to get creative and have fun with this. These are great school projects, 4-H projects to do bee hotels. There's so many cool websites now that will show you how to do this. You can even make them for social bees like bumblebees now, and bumblebees will colonize these, although I've had a lot more success with the solitary bee hotels. But do not put out houses for natural enemies. So there's a lot of people on the marketplace selling things like ladybug houses and butterfly houses, but these insects are not going to colonize these houses. They really want natural things like a compost heap or a pile of leaves or just rocks and stones on the edge of some trees in your landscape or farm. That's where they're going to go. The only thing that's going to go in here is paper wasps. And so that's fine if you want a paper wasp, but you don't want to then look in there and be like, is there any ladybug and paper wasp shoots out at you? It's not fun. And in home landscapes, if people want to see butterflies, sometimes they'll put out fruit feeders and then call me and say, my fruit feeder isn't working, only wasps are using it. Well, you're putting out nectar. So if you do this, you have to be ready to feed everyone that comes to the fruit feeder. So butterflies will come, wasps will come, natural enemies will use this. These can be great, again, at those times of the year where your garden's kind of looking like nothing and there's not a lot of blooms. I'll put out a fruit feeder. Make sure you change it all the time so that you're not intoxicating the insect community and killing it off. And don't put it somewhere where if wasps are in it, it's going to be fearful to people or like attacked. They're going to get attacked. Pets are going to get attacked or something like that. And water. We always forget about water. Insects need water. They need water sources. The water source doesn't have to be pretty again, but it needs to be there. So here are a bunch of honeybees drinking from a fountain. My big COVID project last summer was to put in this water feature, and I found tons and tons of insects using it to drink. I was so excited about that. I started putting water plants in other water features around my yard and saw that they were starting to use those too, but there were a lot of drownings. So then I took saucers from plants and put stones in the saucers and just very narrow water that I would fill up when I was watering. That seemed to work the best. Just very simple, small features. I would see everyday beetles and bees and wasps drinking. It was actually a very cool way to see what sorts of insect life was happening in my yard because they would all go to these water sources. So finally, people ask, well, you know, I have 5 acres of cucurbits. Should I be releasing insects to control pests there? The answer really is no. On big scales or even in backyards, when you release insects, most of the time, those insects have been in the mail for some time. They're not in the best condition. It's very hard to assess the benefits, and it's very expensive for the amount that you would need at a big scale. So again, I focus my whole talk on all the stuff we can do to make the habitat more accessible, and I highly recommend people spend their money there rather than releasing insects. The only time that it really makes sense to release insects is if you are growing under low tunnels and you have an aphid pressure and you don't want to open those up. You can purchase aphid wasps, parasitoids, or something that you can release in there. Or if you have a greenhouse production system, absolutely natural enemy releases make sense in closed environments. And there are many specialized extension materials about that. But in the open field, I really don't think it makes sense. So thank you. As usual, I used up almost all the time talking. I hope that we have a few minutes for questions. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with me to learn about beneficial insects.
Thanks, Mary. That was great. And fascinating. I love hearing about bugs because there's just so many of them and they're just so interesting. We did have one question on the chat that I've been thinking about too as we approach this talk. Some parts of Ohio are expecting cicadas this year and in mass quantities. Where do they fall on the beneficial negative scale of insects, and how worried should we be about these?
So I'm going to first preface this by saying I am not a cicada expert, and I actually need to do more research about, because in my career, this is the first major periodic cicada abundant outbreak that's happened in an area that I've lived. So this isn't something that I've researched, but I have heard that early on, there can be some damage to small trees and shrubs that are newly established by the cicadas. And Dr. Shetler is recommending some different tactics to wrap certain fragile plants that may become overwhelmed by cicadas. But by and large, cicadas are not going to be a pest of most crop plants. And so we're not expecting to have major economic impacts, but there could be some landscaping effects. And I know that there is a PowerPoint presentation being put together for distribution about preparing for cicadas. I just saw it on email today. So I don't know. It is going to be very loud. I will think that's definitely a thing. It's going to be loud. I don't know the level of damage that we might see.
We had somewhat of an outbreak a few years ago, and it was loud, but I don't remember much plant damage. They were more of a nuisance.
Right. And that's what I think. I think that's what I think of with periodic cicadas as more of a nuisance pest.
Yeah.
I just saw another thing in the chat about preparing insect habitat and how to get rid of grass. Let me open the chat so that I can see, or maybe that person can elaborate a little bit. What scale? Are you talking field scale or like backyard scale? Or
Well, if you could address both, that would be great.
Sure.
But I think that's something really important, that it's hard to get rid of the stuff you don't want.
It is. And let me say, to some extent, you just never will, unless you're burning. So if you're doing a huge prairie restoration in the country and you can burn, that's one level, okay? The way that I've always done it is in cities. And so we're dealing with neighbors, and obviously we're not burning prairie plants. So what I tend to tell people is that you are gonna have weeds. Now, how do you start? Well, you can glyphosate. Now, obviously, there are negative effects of using a glyphosate, but they can be short-lived compared to the benefit that you would get. So on a very big scale, you may have to consider using an herbicide to knock down the weed seeds bank in the beginning. I put prairie plantings into vacant lots in Cleveland, and the weed seed pressure was so high that we actually did glyphosate twice and till 3 times to try to bring weeds up and then kill them again, and then bring up more weeds and then kill them again. You can also tarp. So there you're putting down plastic or some other impervious material over the plants. So if you don't want to use herbicide, that is a very effective strategy. You need to leave the material there for at least one growing season, people recommend. And the Xerces Society website has great information on how to do that tarping and different methods that you can use. I was under pressure from a grant to get these things in the ground. And so we ended up herbiciding twice and tilling 3 times and then planting that fall. And we still had incredible weed seed pressure. The other thing that I would suggest if you seed in native plants is the very next growing season after you seed them in, or if you seed them in the spring for that first year, mow the site. Mow it high with a brush mower, like 6 to 8 inches tall, because the prairie plants are going to put most of their effort into establishing roots, and you want to cut off and remove the weed pressure above so that they can start growing rosettes and take over. And that's something else I did. This is going to look horrible like the first 2 years, and people are going to complain, and you're going to think that you really messed it up, and then all of a sudden in the 3rd year the prairie plants will take over and you'll have a lot less seed pressure. What's the best flower seed to plant for vegetable plants? How many acres do you recommend to plant? So if this is in a big farm scale, I think any of the annuals work well. If you want to seed annually and move the vegetable, the buffer strips around, usually people will do, a couple of maybe 3 or 4 meter long wide strip that maybe is adjacent to a planting area, or they'll even do a row every so many rows in the crop. I would need to know a lot more about the specifics of your farm and the goal and the pest problem, but there's a lot of ways you can customize this to fit you. If you're planting native plants, people tend to set aside an area on their farm where they're installing these native plants, and it just stays there. These insects are going to move around. You don't need the planting to be directly adjacent to the crop. So there are a lot of different ways that you can incorporate. The main thing is within maybe a 200 meter buffer circle, of area, you want to have a good nectar and pollen source throughout the season. So maybe think about that as a scale and then incorporating that throughout the farm. Did you need to stratify the seeds before you seeded the prairies? Good question. I actually hired Ohio Prairie Nursery to come in and seed. If you're going to do, I did 50 sites. So this was like a huge undertaking. If you're doing a big area and you're not, and you don't have experience using broadcast seeding of these plants, it might be worth at least talking to a native plant producer. But I purchased all my seed from them and it was ready to plant at that point. But we actually even had them install it just because I wanted to make sure with the number of sites that I had that there was consistency and that it was done right. But I had broadcast seeded on farms before with prairie seeds, and the seeds that we purchased were ready to plant, but that would definitely be a question for the plant producer you're getting them from. There's a lot of great mixes now that you can get for various environments, like urban mixes and farm mixes and things that are sort of tailored to different environments. So we've moved forward a lot from in the last 10 years in doing this. Are there other chat questions or other questions in general?
See anything else in the chat? I will say in my home garden, I love dill, but it can be pretty invasive. So I don't know if that's one you'd want to use in a row crop situation. But
no, a lot of my organic or urban farmers grow a lot of herbs for sale, and they'll have them in raised beds, but they tend to remove them when they just are sick of harvesting and the plant's getting woody and stuff. But like, that's when it can be a really great plant for biodiversity if you can if you don't need the space. But yes, it maybe wouldn't be one that I would do strips. The alyssum works great in strips because it doesn't spread like that.
My dill is covered with caterpillar moth, butterfly moth, what am I saying?
Swallowtails.
Eyes, yeah, like they're gorgeous.
They are. They're very cool. Yeah, if you haven't seen those, you definitely need to plant dill just to see those. They're really.
Yep.
No.
Any other questions coming in? Let me share real quick the author speaker series for those still on here. If you want more insect information, good stuff coming up in March here, including.
And I will say, I would give you a similar talk, so go see one of the other ones. You guys have already seen. And if you haven't heard Doug Ptolemy, he's a remarkable speaker. All of these speakers would be great to hear, but I would definitely register for one of the other ones and learn more about some of the bees and other wildlife plantings.
And I'll put that website where you can do that in the chat here. And there's a couple other things I put in the chat already, like the Xerces Society and
awesome.
Yeah, Bee Labs. So check those out. And next week we'll be talking about annual weeds. So thank you, Mary.
Annual weeds are good. I have a very unpopular opinion. Okay, I'll see everybody later.
I let a few weeds go.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Oh wait, one more question here. How much area should you plant per honeybee hive to support the bees?
Boy, that's a tough question for me to know. I actually, the one type of bee I don't work with is honeybees, and their capacity, their needs for success are something I'm not super familiar with in terms of like what's the minimum requirement. I would reach out to Reed Johnson's group. Reed Johnson, I know, has a huge CRP program about honeybees, and he would be able to answer that for you.
Okay.
Thank you. Take care, all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.